Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes. I'm James Heale, the Spectator's political correspondent and your host for this week's episode. Coming up on the show, Robert Hardman writes about the coronation. He'll be joining me to discuss with the historian Jeremy Black. We already know there's going to be protests, and that's why we've got the Chief Executive of Republic, the staunch anti-monarchist group, on to discuss with Graham Smith. In Westminster, trouble is brewing over Keir Starmer's attempted appointment of Sue Gray as his Chief of Staff. What does all this mean for the government, civil service, and Cabinet Secretary Simon Case? Katy will be joining me to discuss later today. Up in Scotland, the SNP this week celebrated their 16th anniversary in power. Joining me to discuss all this and how it's gone in recent days is Alex Salmond, the former First Minister of Scotland. Ben Lazarus interviews the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, in this week's magazine. I'll be joined by Toby Ord, Oxford academic, to discuss this and the wider debate on artificial intelligence. And finally, Lionel Shriver writes in this week's magazine about Tucker Carlson and what made him so appealing. She'll be joining me later to discuss her TV watching habits. Before we get going, thanks to our brilliant sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, for supporting the show. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. And to celebrate the coronation of King Charles III, you can subscribe to The Spectator and get the next 10 weeks for the price of one. Not only that, but they'll send you a commemorative Spectator mug absolutely free. The coronation of King Charles in just a few days, here happening in Westminster, a few hundred metres away from our office on 22 Old Queen Street. And that's why we've temporarily moved the studio, but we'll hopefully be back there next week. Joining me to discuss the coronation is the historian and journalist and writer Robert Hardman, as well as the academic Jeremy Black, to discuss how coronations have traditionally taken place in Britain over the centuries. Robert, you write in this week's magazine about the coronation and what King Charles's reign is likely to look like. You say there's been a bit of grumbling about how last minute it's all been. Tell us about that.
Well, it has been pretty last minute. I mean, there are still elements of it that we aren't sure about. If you look back to 53, you had over a year and a half of planning, and really by the 6 months out, I think most of the people involved knew what they were going to be doing. Whereas with this coronation, partly because they've had less time to plan it, you've got people who only in the last few days have found out, their particular roles, and also people who found out that they have no role at all. People who found out that who probably thought they would maybe get an invitation and discover they're not. And that's partly a byproduct of the fact that the Abbey is not going to be filled with grandstands this time. I mean, in 1953, they shut down the Abbey in January and installed a railway to be able to build these extraordinary gantries and tier upon tier of seating right up, literally up to the rafters. And that enabled 8,500 people to squeeze in. This time it's just over 2,000. So inevitably, a lot of people are disappointed. I've heard quite a lot of people are disappointed because a lot of categories are not +1. In 1953, if you got an invitation, you could bring your spouse. That's not happening this time. I think a number of people who are invited are quite upset. And then you've got a number of people, and I'd say in the piece, particularly members of the hereditary peerage are quite upset that they're not asked because their families have been part of this extraordinary event for centuries. And this time they're not there at all.
Jeremy, what do you make of the coronation preparations and the news last week that people are being encouraged to say an oath of allegiance to Charles III?
Well, I think coronation proceedings have always varied. And I mean, I agree. I thought Robert's piece was excellent and his Life of the Queen was really the best available as well. But it's worth bearing in mind, if you look back at coronations, you look at the coronation of George II, for example, in 1727. These were often chaotic occasions. The coronation of George IV was a chaotic occasion. So I think one has to bear in mind that if you slow down history and look at it in detail, you often find confusion, chaos, people having a row, people having a tiz. The key thing is how it will look in hindsight. And there's no reason to believe that this will not look anything other than an impressive coronation and part of an impressive reign. I mean, I agree with Robert's piece. The king does seem to be enjoying himself. I agree with him. The king is an amazing example of soft power and an enabler, and as Robert says, a mobilizer. And I think, there is no reason to believe that the coronation will not be seen as anything other than an excellent start to the next stage of the reign.
And obviously we're hoping it won't be as chaotic as some of those past ones, Robert, but what are the other differences, other than obviously you mentioned the huge reduction in the number of people going that, like 1953? What are the other kind of key differences from the last time we did this 70 years ago?
Well, Jeremy hit on a very important point there, and thank you for your kind remarks. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, they were often disastrous, but it didn't really matter that much because the only people who could see what went on were the people who were really close to the action. You know, even those in the nave had no idea what was going on up in the theatre, in between the two transepts. This is the first, if you like, made-for-TV coronation. The last one was not. The last one, there was a big debate, well-known debate, for the first few months about whether it should be televised at all, and the view of the Queen and Churchill and others, and particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury, was that it should not be televised because the Archbishop did not want any mistakes, and there was a long history of Archbishops making pretty disastrous mistakes. So it was really only relatively late in the day. The Queen and Churchill acquiesced and said, right, you can televise most of it, but you can't obviously televise the anointing, and you can't televise the Holy Communion. So it was sort of partially televised this time. And also, if you look at the cameras, there was a deal done. It's sort of in all the documents, it says, and no close-ups in capital letters was part of the deal with the BBC. This time, everything is going to be beautifully shot by the BBC and watched by billions around the world in a way that the last one simply wasn't. And I do think that's sort of an absolute game changer, if you like, in terms of how it will look. And Jeremy's absolutely right. I mean, I've always found with royal events, you have these squalls and arguments in the run-up. Every single one. I mean, with the wedding of Harry and Meghan, it was Meghan's dad. With the wedding of William and Kate, it was the issue of Blair and Brown not being invited, and why is the Syrian ambassador on the list? With the wedding of Charles and Camilla in 2005, there was a whole problem to do with the licensing arrangements. It had to move to the town hall in Windsor, and then the Pope died, which forced the whole thing back by a day. And time after time, the Golden Jubilee, I mean, the poor Queen, she lost her mother and her sister just weeks before it started. So you have this sort of history of these big royal events, which seem to be beset by one problem after another in the run-up. And then they come along and they're brilliant. And everyone goes, wow, wasn't that amazing? And I'm pretty sure that at probably about 6 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, everybody will be sort of sitting around going, well, that really was something, wasn't it? And if it wasn't, then, this will be on the internet and you can come back and laugh at me next week.
You write in your piece, Robert, that Charles is a great traditionalist. I mean, looking ahead to the months after, and the start of his reign, is this going to be sort of informing how he conducts the monarchy going forward? Because there's been some debate around him being a moderniser as well. Yeah,
I'm sure there are going to be a constant run of sort of modernising touches. There's a lot of stuff that goes with accession to the throne that simply hasn't been touched on yet. I mean, for example, I'll just pluck one out of thin air, but I mean, you've got all the royal warrant holders. They're all waiting to see what happens because those run out fairly shortly. Everything to do with what sort of royal transport. How are they going to reconfigure Buckingham Palace? Who's going to be doing what in the royal family? I mean, all these are decisions yet to come. I mean, at the moment, the focus is very squarely on let's get through this coronation.
Mm. Jeremy, in terms of what sort of changed this time and what has been kept, what kind of traditions have been kept for this coronation, and how does this much mark a break with the past and a continuation of what's come before it?
I think a lot of it is continuation, but I'd like to take up that last point about modernisation. The last great moderniser was Albert, as it were, Queen Victoria's Albert, and he had a vision for what the monarchy could mean and should mean in a modernising Britain. And I think that in his own way, the new king will be a kind of more subtle, because Prince Albert was not particularly subtle, a more subtle example of the same. And Albert was very important in moving the monarchy forward from the rather tired shape it had been under with George IV and William IV, and giving it an enormous boost of life, helping to make it a really active part of the British Constitution. And I think that for the king, the new king, the problem is the British Constitution and the nature of a divided politics. It's not him. I mean, it's how he interacts with actually a public which is not terribly at ease always with itself, and with a politics that's quite divided. And that against the context also of separatist political movements, the possible future of Northern Ireland within maybe a different constitutional political context. All of these are challenges for him. And I think we're jolly lucky we've got an intelligent, active and thoughtful monarch on the stage at the present moment.
Yeah, just to round us off, Robert, I mean, this is obviously, we're talking about the coronation. It's going to be a very happy celebratory day in all likelihood. But we've seen, the rise of Not My King movements as well. Lots of protests across the country where he's been going as well. And as Jeremy says, it's quite a challenging time for the monarchy and the country as well. Prince Charles hasn't always, as Prince Charles, he wasn't always perhaps the most politically adept at some of these things. Do you think he needs a sort of chance to step up? Will it be quite a challenge for him, would you say, as king?
I think he's given it a lot of thought. I think there is this idea that he's going to have to learn to button his lip, as I say in the piece. And actually, I mean, this is a guy who's been doing public duties for longer than most people in this country have been alive. I mean, he was starting royal duties back in the 60s. He's been heir to the throne for longer than anybody else has ever been. So he's had a pretty good time to dwell on it and think about it. Jeremy made some very good, very interesting points there. I mean, I think he does face a pretty, you might say, bleak horizon with issues to do with the union. I mean, that's got to be number one. I mean, he's king of the UK. I mean, how much of that remains a K, and how does it remain united? I mean, those are serious issues. So you've got the whole issue of the other realms, which he becomes king of, or is now king of, 14 realms. And there is, some of those are very now vociferously Republican. And so I think it's safe to say some of them will go Republican. How do you sort of separate? How do you depersonalize that so that it doesn't become a sort of almost a vote of no confidence in Charles III? I mean, on that point, I think he is very good. I think he's very sympathetic. He's a clever man. He's very cultured. I'm trying to think of a monarch who has had quite such a sort of love of the arts. I think you probably have to go back to someone like George III, maybe. 12 new pieces commissioned just for this coronation. So, he's a deep thinker. Now, is that an asset? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll have to see. But I mean, he does have all sorts of problems ahead. But I think the key thing we always have to remember is everybody, particularly and you mentioned the protesters there, the Not My King lot, they're a tiny minority. I mean, I've seen them in action, but they're vocal, but they're a tiny minority. But what we have to remember is he can't do everything. People say, well, why hasn't he done this? Why hasn't he apologised for that? Why hasn't he? I mean, so much of what gets thrown at the monarchy, it's not really up to them. They're a constitutional monarchy. And as I say in my piece, people say, well, why didn't he go to COP27? Why doesn't he do this? He does have to do what his government and his ministers tell him. And I think actually a reminder of that comes right at the start of this coronation service. For the first time, you'll have this sort of moment where a chorister comes up and effectively says to him, what are you doing here? And he says, I'm here as a servant. And I think it's a reminder to all of us that, fundamentally, he does actually do what we tell him to do. We don't do what he tells us to do. Just remember that.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Jeremy. Of course, not everyone is happy about the coronation. Joining me now is Graham Smith, the Chief Executive of Republic, the staunch anti-monarchist group who think that's all a bit of a sham. Graham, thank you for joining us today. Just first of all, how will you be marking the coronation on Saturday?
Well, we're going to be protesting on Trafalgar Square at the edge of the coronation, so we will be very visible and very loud, so making our mark and making sure that we cannot be ignored, just to really drive home the point that we're no longer a nation of royalists, really, and that there needs to be a serious debate about the future of the monarchy.
And do you feel that hasn't really taken place yet? Talk us through the kind of last 6-7 months or so since the accession of King Charles, because it was often said that Elizabeth II was the monarchy's best asset in the UK in terms of being seen as quite a successful monarch, I think, by everyone, regardless of political persuasion. What has Charles meant for Republic and the Republican movement?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a massive boost in support, and we're seeing the quite a significant shift in the polling, certainly from people saying they support the monarchy to sort of being unsure. So the don't knows have gone up as well, but some polling puts us up by 10 points, the monarchy down by about 20 points. So whereas typically around 75 is now consistently under 60. Yeah, I mean, we've had a massive influx of supporters and money, so we're now able to do a much bigger protest than we might have done previously. The big difference is that the monarchy was the Queen. I mean, I think it's more than she was their asset. She was the monarchy for most people, and Charles isn't the Queen, and that's his biggest problem. And I think that the mood, sort of the background music has changed as well, and I think the spell has been broken. People don't really think of them as being exceptional or beyond criticism anymore.
And I just wanted, I suppose, really, I mean, we've been here in some ways a bit before. In the 1990s, the monarchy had a dip in support. And then, of course, they recovered. And I think people perhaps took a second look. And obviously the Queen did many years of service, etc. Why is it different this time? What's not to say King Charles might be seen as a very successful monarch and, as previous monarchs have done, adapt to the changing times, maybe reform the institution perhaps. And, we might see the polls actually change and the public become more monarchist in their support.
Well, I think it's highly unlikely that things will turn around. I mean, the long-term projections done by sort of these social attitude surveys suggest that there's been a general decline over the last 30 years, even though that has sort of gone bumped up and down. But I don't think it went down quite as much in the 1990s. But the Queen was still there, and we still had another 20 or 30 years of the Queen in order to sort of turn that around. So they carefully managed what was going on. A lot of it also was more around sort of weddings, marriages failing and that sort of thing, very personal stuff. And they kind of pushed people like Edward and Andrew to the sidelines to some extent. And then, of course, they had William and Harry, who certainly in the first 10 years of this century were probably seen as a big help to the image. But all that's gone now. So we now have had the Andrew scandal dragging on for 11, 12 years. We've had the massive row around Harry and Meghan, which has divided royalists as well as other opinion. And of course, the Queen is no longer there to turn it around. She was kind of their heat shield. She deflected an awful lot of criticism and concerns in a way that Charles just doesn't. And I think that is a concern for them because I don't think they're going to be able to turn that around. I think this is a downward trajectory, and at some point in the next decade or so, we will see fewer than a 50% supporting the monarchy, and then they're in quite a lot of trouble.
And that's really interesting that you talk about individuals there. When you see people joining up Republic, talking to people who are sort of, as you say, seeing this surge in the polls, I mean, what is it so much? Is it to do with the individuals of the royal family? Or is it perhaps a sense of maybe the institution isn't as responsive or popular as it once was?
I think there's an instinctive sort of understanding that it's not democratic and we probably shouldn't have it, and people sort of tolerate it because they think it's good for the economy and that other people like it and so on. But I think an awful lot of that was also wrapped up in the Queen. People were happy to sort of make an allowance for the Queen to continue being the Queen, which they're not. That sort of generosity doesn't extend to Charles. So their sort of core instincts as Democrats are kicking in more fiercely, and I think that most people have grown up with the Queen already on the throne, so it's kind of a fixture of British life. Whereas now we've actually witnessed a succession. We now have seen this man who's been Prince Charles all our lives suddenly become King Charles, with headlines around lack of payment of inheritance tax and headlines around how wealthy he is and all this kind of thing. And then huge questions over why we have a coronation, which is not required. There's no legal or constitutional requirement for it. But a coronation that's going to cost, by some estimates, £250 million during a cost of living crisis. So I think they've lost their star player, and they've also lost their star player at a pretty difficult time for the country, and I think that also plays into it.
And finally, Graham, I just want to ask, I mean, do you think there's a danger perhaps with the protests of the coronation, etc., that, Republic might have a very worthy argument, etc. But is there not a danger that you're playing into perhaps opponent stereotypes of being quite earnest, puritanical, killjoys, as they say? What would you say to that? And is there a danger perhaps of Republic's image maybe clouding some of its goals and achievements?
So, let's remember that most people are not interested in the Jubilee. There's 9% enthusiasm. People will watch it on TV, but I think that I think most people will understand that there is a need to protest at these sorts of things. But also, we will not be. We're being quite deliberate in trying to keep the mood light, and there's going to be speeches. There'll also be music, and there'll just be engagement with people around us. It's not about shouting down the royalists or spoiling anyone's day. It's about just being part of the day as a voice of opposition. So, we don't want to. We're very clear that we want to project ourselves, in the image of Republicans in a positive light as well. But I think that people accept that, obviously, if there's a big royal event these days, then it's perfectly reasonable to protest at it if you're a Republican.
And at risk of me getting sent to the Tower, tell us where that main protest is.
So the main protest is going to be on Trafalgar Square, just near where the procession passes through. And there will be smaller protests along the Mall and on Whitehall.
Thank you very much, Graham. Appreciate you joining us. Our political editor, Katy writes in this week's magazine about Sue Gray and Simon Case. Are the pair's fates entwined? She joins me now to discuss. Katy, you write in this week's column about how these two civil servants, one former, one current, have had their fates entwined, Simon Case and Sue Gray. Tell us how this came to be.
Yes, so we are in a civil service fight, one could say, whereby there are two appointments. Simon Case was, of course, appointed by Boris Johnson some time ago, but a beleaguered cabinet secretary, successive scandals brought back to light because of the Richard Sharp row last week, which is the Richard Sharp stepping down as BBC chairman over his link to a loan for Boris Johnson. His defence was effectively that he didn't tell the BBC appointments process or others about this because he'd told Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. He thought that was enough. It turns out it wasn't, and Simon Case doesn't remember the exact details of that conversation, perhaps conveniently. So more questions about Simon Case. And then you have Sue Gray, former senior civil servant who was appointed by Keir Starmer as his chief of staff back in March, but can't actually take that role on yet because it has to go through 2 investigations to see if she broke the civil service code in not declaring conversations with the Labour Party when she should have done. And of course, Labour did not announce it. It was first reported in the press. And they're entwined not just because Simon Case clearly has a role right now in terms of leading the civil service on how they handled the Sue Gray situation, but because if Sue Gray does become chief of staff, it's very unlikely that Simon Case would be cabinet secretary. Labour would not keep him. So they both perhaps can't exist in the same house.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question I wanted to ask. First of all, Sue Gray, has this kind of really backfired? Because he wanted to be in place probably 6 to 8 months before an election, so you have all that transition planning. Is there now a sense that the advisors become the story, and actually you could have had any number of probably senior impressive people rather than the one person who's like to cause the most controversy?
Yeah, and I think that's actually it in the sense Sue Gray has become the story. So I think Labour have said that they will appoint her whatever Akbar say, because the second investigation will ultimately rule on the terms of her appointment, and it could delay it, saying, it could be delayed by a year, saying she can't start till this time next year, and here are the conditions on what she can actually advise on given her prior knowledge of things. So you could basically make the appointment complicated and so forth. But I think given Labour say they will wait any time and they will still have her as chief of staff, there are some who doubt that this will happen, how is she going to perform as a chief of staff? Because what they want her really there for is the planning for government. Yeah. That's obviously a bit harder if she doesn't start too much nearer the next election. And then also you have a situation by which I think because there is so much media around her, we have seen successive special advisors, government advisors. As soon as you're the person being written about the most, it tends to not go very well for you. You look, back to Alistair Campbell, but also Dominic Cummings. For a while was a gift to journalists everywhere, but once you become a gifted journalist, eventually figures think, why is this person getting all the attention? And also you have a lot more scrutiny. You're supposed to be in the shadows, not the main person. And then even if you think actually back to David Canzini, who was a senior figure near one of the various later stages of Boris Johnson's team, and Guta Hari, exactly, both became the story, and that always creates attention. So I think that it just means the appointment is becoming trickier for Labour, even if they are still adamant that she is the person they want.
You highlight in this piece rightly that their fates are entwined together. I mean, surely there's a likely scenario, which is that regardless of what happens with Sue Gray, Labour win the next election, and on day one, Keir Starmer is probably likely to show the door to Simon Case, maybe with Sue Gray as the Chief of Staff.
Yes, so I think there's little love lost between Simon Case and Sue Gray, particularly at this point, given the various investigations. Sue Gray not, of course, working with the Cabinet Office one, and allies of Sue Gray will say they think Simon Case has a vendetta against her. Now, allies of Simon Case will deny that, so we'll get the ally part of this interview out of the way so we don't get into trouble. But yes, there is very little chance. It's hard to imagine a scenario where Simon Case would stay on as Cabinet Secretary, not just because of his relationship with Sue Gray, but also the fact that I think that Keir Starmer and others have been critical of Simon Case. He is seen as a very political Cabinet Secretary. He was appointed, I say in the piece, because by Boris Johnson, but back when Dominic Cummings was riding high, and speaking to figures who were in that number 10, they said he was effectively led to be Dominic Cummings' stooge, and let Dom be Dom was the phrase. So I think there's doubts in his ability to drive the machine. So it's hard to imagine Sue Gray being in number 10 at the same time as Simon Case in the future. I think the question is, does that mean when you're looking at Simon Case, it's very easy to find civil servants being very critical of him at the moment, but there's much more sympathy for him in government. I think that's partly because there's a better the devil you know stance, but also if we just think cynically for a second, if you have a Cabinet Secretary who ultimately will lose their job, likely if a Labour government comes in, there probably is some advantage to that to a Tory government.
Very true. And also there's a lack of successors as well, because you had Tom Scholar recently leave the Treasury as well. Talking to some civil servants, there seems to be a wider crisis here, right? That's what ultimately both of these figures point to, is that we've had a real problem in British politics with process, the civil service in recent years. A lot of crises happened with COVID and Brexit. Do you think this is going to be cleared up anytime soon?
So I think it's quite clear, no matter what angle you come at from, that the civil service is not in a good state at the moment in terms of the relationship with the government, and not just about briefing wars, but how do you drive the machinery of government? Both Simon Case's appointment a few years ago, and then also Sue Gray's earlier this year, are political leaders trying to work out how to make the machine work for them. And it's quite hard at the moment. Morale's very low in the civil service. There's lots of talk of civil service reform. I think that there's a problem there in the sense that Rishi Sunak doesn't have long really before the next election, so it's not seen as a key voter priority, even though there are some in government who would like that to be something that happens before the next election. And then I think for Labour, there is a risk that they are almost lionising the civil service. So they are saying the civil service can do no wrong, apart from of course when they're turning on Sue Gray in the form of Simon Case. And does that mean that if they do get into power, it's harder to then challenge civil servants, because all governments have these problems. They might be more heightened under a Tory government with the various rhetoric, but a Labour government would soon come into many of these issues too.
Great, thanks Katy. Now to Scotland. It's 16 years this week since the SNP came to power, so join me to discuss that anniversary and the wider debate around Scotland's future is Alex Salmond, the former First Minister who now leads the Alba Party. Alex, thank you for joining us today on SpectatorTV. First of all, before we get on to Scottish politics, the monarchy, you're down here currently demonstrating, is that correct?
No, I'm doing my pre-coronation tour before I leave, before the coronation. Apparently it's a ballot, I don't know if you know this, to get in, a ballot of Privy Councillors like myself or members of Parliament. And I didn't know this until I got phoned by a member of Parliament, who'll be nameless, who was very miffed about this situation and wondered if I might complain about it, given that he reckoned I probably didn't want to go anyway, so wouldn't have any self-interest in the matter, as it were. I declined because I thought there was bigger issues at stake, but I have to say I've got a sneaking sympathy for him. We've got a coronation where, Charles will have invited every ecologist, vegetarian, Ant and Deck, a seat for them both apparently, that you can think of.
but there's not a seat for every member of Parliament, the elected House, which I think is a bit much, actually. I mean, I don't really care, as I say, because I'm not a member of Parliament anymore, but it's a bit strange. Also, it's pretty insane, I would have thought, for the new king to offend so many members of the elected House. So that's the situation. Apparently, apart from the leaders of the political parties, everybody else has got to stick their name in a ballot. And if you come out in the raffle, then you get to the Abbey. If you get second prize, you get to go in the tent in Victoria Gardens. Which I think is a very strange way to run a coronation, but well, hey ho, it's up to King Charles.
I've certainly heard of a lot of disgruntled Tory MPs. And speaking of disgruntled parliamentarians, what is the mood like, would you say, in terms of the wider independence movement, but also what's going on with the SNP right now?
Well, the SNP is obviously in a lot of trouble. Whether it's it's still an existential crisis, but whether it's an extinction event or one of these big bumps in the road, but it's certainly a pothole. It's more than a bump; it's a pothole at least. The independence movement's doing all right. I mean, the independence movement. I mean, it's quite interesting. If you go back to 2011, a year I like remembering, because we won a majority in a proportional parliament, which is tricky, and the SNP support I think was 45%. But support for independence was below 30%. Now we've got almost the reverse. Well, the reverse. I mean, the SNP support is tumbling down the 30s just now, whereas support for independence is at 45% and above in some polls. So independence support is doing fine. SNP support is in a lot of trouble because the SNP is in trouble. Now, whether Humza Yousaf can pull himself out of that poison chalice or not remains to be seen.
And Humza Yousaf, I mean, what was he like as a minister? You appointed him.
I did, yes. And before that, an employer. I gave him not just his first ministerial job, I gave him his first job in my constituency office in Peterhead. So he's a perfectly nice guy, perfectly able, perfectly intelligent. Whether he's up to this sort of situation, or whether indeed any new First Minister would be, I mean, it's not an easy situation. I mean, in a way, if it was Kate Forbes or Ash Regan, who were the women candidates against Humza, they would have been in a better position because they were clearly outsiders. So they wouldn't have had to say, look, all this mess has got nothing to do with me. People would have understood that and believed it. But Humza, as the continuity candidate, has a real difficulty. And for some reason that I'm unsure of, instead of doubling down, which is what he should have done, I mean, he should have had a Berlin Wall between him and everything that had gone before. He should have, sacked everybody or put them in gardening leave or whatever you do these days, and made it clear that it was nothing to do with him. He seems to have, even though he's now no longer saying he's the continuity candidate, he's edging his way to distancing himself from the poisoned legacy. He's not doing enough of it. I mean, the first thing he should have done in these circumstances, which are extremely difficult, is to clear the decks.
But is that possible? I mean, yesterday was the 16th anniversary of that 2007 election where the SNP came to power. After such a long time, surely any party of any political complexion was having difficulty reinventing itself.
Well, no, I think there's plenty of examples of parties renewing themselves in power. I mean, the Liberals in Japan, I mean, they went on forever. I mean, every time the opposition thought they were getting somewhere, they just sort of elected a new leader, changed their nature. I mean, a lot of parties can do that. I mean, it's not easy. And of course, parties do acquire bad habits. Complacency, time service, hangers-on. And, the trouble with the SNP in the last few years, it's showing all of the signs of, the Labour Party in Scotland in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, I look at the ranks of the SNP and I go back to when I was in Parliament with, 50 Labour MPs down in the early 1990s. And, it's Animal Farm, isn't it? The two species have kind of merged. So there are difficulties with being in power a long time. But if you're a new First Minister, particularly, a new Asian First Minister, clearly different from anything that's gone before, younger than the people who've gone before as well. I mean, at least you've got the start of saying, it's time for a new age. You can engage in renewal. Whether Humza has got what it takes to do that, I don't think so is the answer, but But, you can get surprised in politics.
You mentioned Kate Forbes then. There's been a lot of reports around her plans, those of her allies, etc. You were in Holyrood for 16 odd years. What advice would you kind of give her tactically in terms of maybe positioning herself as a candidate potentially between what happened with Humza Yousaf, but also trying to push a slightly different policy agenda within the SNP?
Well, within the SNP, I would, if I were Kate, or giving her advice, I would deploy one of the most underrated political crafts, one which I didn't specialise in myself, to tell you the truth. It's always easier to give advice. Is silence. Within the SNP, I would say nothing. Out with the SNP, different matter. And to some extent, she's already started that. It was quite interesting. She did a paper with the think tank Commonweal. Now, that was clever for two reasons. The subject matter was poverty and the approach to it. And secondly, Commonweal's a left-wing think tank, and Kate obviously has been accused, I think a bit unjustly, but because of her social attitudes, it's been assumed she's some sort of classic right-winger, the Spectator candidate. But
kiss of death.
Well, it wouldn't be the kiss of life, let's put it that way. To be fair, she's not that at all. I mean, she comes from a tradition, a very honourable tradition in Scottish politics, this sort of Highland radical tradition, which kind of marched off in a fairly conservative social attitude with a fairly radical political attitude. I mean, these are sort of people who'd hang lairds and landlords from the nearest lamppost. Not that you'd get many lampposts, but nonetheless, if there was an available lamppost, they would certainly hang the lairds. So it's not a classic right of centre position, but so it was a good move, I would say, a clever move to publish that pamphlet with a left-wing think tank. I mean, that shows some pretty intelligent repositioning.
I mean, obviously you were in the SNP for so long, and you know the kind of feel for it, the party machines, etc. How it sort of operates. I mean, what sort of, if you look at the history of the SNP, it's obviously been sort of uncontested leadership elections traditionally. There was it's been quite a sort of central top-down control for most of its time in government. I mean, can you have someone like that? Will the membership really go for someone like that if they're seen as opposing the leadership?
Well, I don't agree, actually. I mean, the SNPs have had some, both times I became leader in 1990 and then again in 2004, they were pretty heavily contested. I mean, in 1990, I was a young whippersnapper, obviously barely out of school, and I was very much the outsider, probably deservedly so looking back, and I was up against a lovely lady called Margaret Ewing, a wonderful woman. But very much, a very able parliamentarian, a very vigorous campaigner, and very much the favourite. So it was quite a contest. And then in 2004, although, by then I became the favourite when I entered the race, but I had a bit of dilly-dallying before I got to that position. So I wasn't expected that I would come back as leader. So these were pretty strong contests, and they went on for a long time, months. For some reason, which is only known to a few, I suspect, the present leadership election was rushed through before people had much time to think about it.
And how do you see the next 18 months or so leading up to that general election, and then looking forward to the 2026 Holyrood elections? How do you see that panning out in terms of the SNP and the wider independence movement?
Well, obviously I speak as leader of Alapa, so I'm speaking not as a dispassionate observer. But the rational thing to do is twofold. One, because of the political trials and tribulations of the SNP, it would be a good idea to actively, intentionally separate the wider national movement from the SNP as a governing party. You do that to allow it to campaign for independence with vigour, unimpinged by what's going on in government. Meanwhile, you get on with governing. Humza Yousaf's biggest job is to get the government back to something like competence. That'd be a real gain at the present moment. So that would unleash what is a very strong movement. That is the 45%. That's the think tanks, the activist groups, the campaigners, the petitioners internationally, all these groups. There were so many acronyms, you could shake a stick at them. It's amazing. But let it free. Let 1,000 flowers bloom in the independence movement. And secondly, you've got to face the electoral test of a UK general election next year. Now, usually we've been in positions historically where the SNP brand has been stronger than the independence brand. So at various times, people like myself found ways to square that circle, by saying, look, vote for me or vote for the SNP and there'll be a referendum on independence. You're in a different position now. You're now in a position where the independence brand is stronger than the SNP brand. So the intelligent political thing to do is to come to an accommodation between the pro-independence parties, which are the SNP, by far still the dominant party, ALPA, the Green Party, even fringe parties like the Scottish Socialists who believe in independence, and make sure there's one independence candidate in each parliamentary constituency. Now, the bulk of these, the vast bulk of these, would be SNP, but they should stand not just as SNP, but as SNP Scotland United for Independence. And the ALPA candidate is far less, obviously, would be ALPA Scotland United for Independence. So with the Green candidates and so on and so forth, to get one independence candidate. Now, the beauty of that is not just a one candidate, which is always an advantage in a first past the post election, but an independence candidate. So people would be less worrying about the SNP and its brand and its image. It would be very clear that what people were being asked to do in that constituency was to back the individual and back the concept of independence. Now, various places in world politics, in similar situations, that's been tried, highly successfully. You think of Quebec, when the PQ, the Parti Québécois, was in a bit of trouble, hadn't had any success even contesting federal elections, and then they formed the Bloc Quebec, and it swept the boards. So there's good parallels internationally as to why that might be. You could even take it as a parallel. It's not an exact parallel. What Lloyd George did in the Coupon election. Everybody, the Welsh magician managed to persuade everybody else to stand, whether they were Liberals or Conservatives or Labour for that matter, Lloyd George Coupon. and it was the Lloyd George Coupon that got them elected. I say it's not an exact parallel, but that's the sort of big move that you need to make under the circumstances that Humza Yousaf finds himself in. The temptation, of course, is when you're under fire, like in the trenches, to hunker down and hope that a shell doesn't hit you. If you do that, I'm afraid your shell will have your name on it. What you have to do is get over the top and find a way to shift the political debate. Now, this week, for example, I'm sure Humza doesn't see it this way, but he got very upset when I pointed out that, he, as Keeper of the Great Seal, could have stopped the Stone of Destiny coming down for the coronation. And he could have had, if he wanted to, a political standoff on Scotland's rights as a nation. That's what the Stone of Destiny represents. It represents Scottish sovereignty. That's why it was taken, stolen, pinched, filched from Scotland by Edward I in the first place. He was eliminating all traces of Scottish identity. That's what he was doing. He was a highly intelligent, somewhat ruthless Plantagenet king. So it's a symbol of Scottish sovereignty. And at a time when the government of the day is not recognising and acknowledging Scottish sovereignty, then as Keeper of the Great Seal, and therefore in control of the fate of the Stone of Destiny, a First Minister could just say, well, you're not having it, politely, but firmly, and would have commanded the international attention of the world at the standoff in the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle. And if he'd done that, then people would have been talking about Scotland's rights as a nation, and they would have been talking about this extraordinary contretemps between Edinburgh and London, and what they wouldn't have been talking about was the financial woes of the Scottish National Party. All Humza could see was that I was somehow criticising him about a lump of rock. No. The trouble is, if you don't understand history and the importance of it, you don't understand or command the present, or for that matter, formulate the future.
Thank you, Alex. Now I'm joined by Oxford academic Toby Ord to discuss the future of artificial intelligence following Geoffrey Hinton's resignation this week from Google. Toby, thanks for joining us. What are your thoughts on Geoffrey Hinton's resignation?
Yes, well, Geoffrey Hinton is a huge name in AI, and especially deep learning. He was one of the people who pioneered the approach of backpropagation, which is how a neural network learns, and also deep neural networks, having very many layers in order for them to be able to learn more complex concepts. So it's hard to get a bigger name in AI than Geoffrey Hinton. And he's resigned from Google in part so that he can feel free to talk about the risks that this technology that he's helped develop might pose.
And what do you make of that? I mean, do you think that actually AI does pose these kind of risks that he's warning about?
I think that it could. This is an area where there's a very wide range of opinion among AI researchers, but the deep concerns about the risks of AI are rising within that community. And something like half of the foremost AI researchers have now gone on the record expressing concerns that human extinction could be a possible consequence of the technology that they're developing, or some permanent disempowerment of humanity at the hands of AI systems. The other half, many of them are also very concerned about risks that could be posed, although they think that they're of a different kind and smaller, albeit still large risks to do with discrimination and bias and concentration of power and things along those lines.
You mentioned the human extinction rather casually. Talk us through that. How exactly are we all going to die because of AI?
Yeah, I think in some ways the best way to think of it, well, here are a few ways to think of it. So one is that the reason that it's humans that are calling the shots on planet Earth at the moment, and where the fate of other species are ultimately up to us, is because of our intelligence and generally our cognitive abilities, our ability to work with each other to achieve goals. And what we're planning on doing, or at least the AI researchers are, is developing new entities that are better than us at this unique attribute. So I think the default pathway there, unless we do anything to prevent it, would be that it's ultimately these new things that are calling the shots. So that's one way to look at it. And then if you say, well, what can you do in order to ensure that they're aligned with our interests, or that they can always obey our instructions, that the people who are working on that particular part of artificial intelligence, called AI alignment research, that they're actually leading the concern that we're not going to be able to develop those techniques in time, and that we'll have systems that are more powerful than us before we have systems that we know how to control.
And Hinton in his interview asks us to think about, a baby with a mother in terms of, is that a sort of useful analogy in terms of the control relationship, and also perhaps the sense of, innocence or naivety in terms of how little we know compared to what AI would know?
Yeah, it's a complex one because the sense in which an infant controls their parents is quite complicated, and it's not that they're planning to do so or something like that. But he's right to raise this question about how often can a less intelligent entity control the more intelligent one without the more intelligent one eventually wresting that control away. Another example that he could have used perhaps is maybe a very intelligent criminal who's been captured and put in prison can then be controlled ultimately by the state and not able to escape from the prison due to an asymmetry in the position that the prisoner is now in where they've been captured. So there could be something like that as well, where effectively, because we can design the constraints that our AI systems are in, that by designing those constraints and the types of actions they're allowed to take and so on, and by being able to observe those actions and log them, that's another way that we could hope to have some upper hand over a system that's more powerful than us. And we may also be able to design its goals in an accurate way so that it's aiming to achieve the types of things that lead to our flourishing, which would be another hope for controlling a more intelligent system. Although, as I said, that one seems to be very difficult to do.
And we're talking here in the UK now, but how do different regimes around the world compare in terms of their kind of framework here? I mean, are some countries pulling ahead? Presumably America is one of them with AI. What are the kind of different nations' approaches to AI?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's pretty similar among the leading researchers on on AI. There are a few leading labs working on what's called artificial general intelligence. And these are the types of systems that would aspire to be able to do the wide range of tasks that a human could do, and to be able to do it as well or better than a human, such as DeepMind here in London, and also OpenAI and Anthropic in Silicon Valley. So they are working on, among other things, training these large language models. And so that's these chatbots and systems that can read the entire internet and then give seemingly intelligent responses to the types of questions that we ask them and the tasks that we set for them.
And I mean, in this piece, Hinton suggests we could reach artificial general intelligence with about 20 years. How realistic a timescale is that? Because many people's experience of ChatGPT might be, it's interesting, it's a useful guide, but they can't see really how that kind of evolves over the next few years and decades.
Yeah, I mean, there is this challenge here, and in the interview, I see that Hinton acknowledges it, that we don't want to just reason from ignorance to say we can't see how it would get there, so therefore it can't get there. But nor do we want to just assume the opposite. Ultimately, we need to acknowledge that we're in a position of quite deep uncertainty whenever it comes to predicting the pathway of a rapidly developing technology. And I think that what some people don't recognize is that the uncertainty doesn't mean that you're entitled to believe whatever you want to believe. And similarly, the diversity of opinion among AI researchers doesn't mean that they can have any opinion they want and just take it to the grave. Ultimately, we need to acknowledge that there is a great deal of uncertainty and disagreement about what's going to happen, and that we don't know how to take possibilities such as human extinction off the table at the moment, and that's deeply alarming, even if we're not saying that it's certain to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there about the disagreement, and we've spoken about how half the community seems to be very divided and hostile about this. Yet, I mean, despite Hinton's resignation earlier this week, causing headlines, there were lots of news stories about it, it seems we're racing ahead regardless, even though, as you say, half of the sort of community involved with this are deeply opposed. Just will this resignation have any effect? And what really is going to slow down this race to AI? Because where I'm standing, I can't really see anything stopping it.
That's a good question. And as Hinton mentions, part of the concern is a certain kind of race dynamic. There is that when Microsoft launched their new Bing, which I think was something of a fiasco, but it's in an attempt to outdo Google at search, which is Google's core product. It then kind of forced Google's hand to deploy systems that it was previously not deploying, and that triggering a race between these huge corporations to develop, better and better AI systems as quickly as possible. And we saw with Bing that it was really not ready for prime time. It was definitely not aligned with human interests. I mean, it was the first AI system to threaten to kill an AI ethics researcher. And also, in terms of journalism, it threatened an AP journalist. It threatened to expose them for war crimes, which they, as far as I know, had not committed, because it had written a bad story about Bing, which Bing assumed must be false because it was taught to believe that it was always correct about things. So these are, sci-fi plot lines, right? That have become real. Now, this system, while it threatens revenge on people who say bad things about it on the internet, it can't fulfill that revenge. And probably it's not going to kill anyone. But I don't think we can wait until people are killed by an AI system before we actually try to regulate it, or at least take some serious steps. Otherwise, people are going to get killed before we take action.
Well, on that cheery note, thank you very much, Toby, for joining us today. And finally, Lionel Shriver joins me now to discuss the fallout from Tucker Carlson's departure from Fox News last week. Now, Lionel, you write in this week's magazine about Tucker Carlson, and there's a line here in which you say that television appearances rattle me, and my first instinct is to try to get out of them. So we're very grateful that you've joined us today on SpecTV. You've written this week about Tucker Carlson. Explain to us why you're motivated to write about this following his recent axing from the Fox News network?
Well, it really has to do with the fact that it has changed the nature of my evenings. So I feel personally impacted. This column is a bit of a confession because in the United States, in the circles that I run in, saying that you ever watch Tucker Carlson demonizes you for all time. So I decided I needed to come clean, that I feel personally aggrieved. I force feed myself a certain amount of heavily left-wing mainstream media on a daily basis. You know, I watch the Channel 4 news every night. I watch the PBS NewsHour on YouTube from the United States when it goes live at midnight. I keep atrocious hours. And then Tucker Carlson is put on YouTube at 2 a.m., which is right around the time that I'm flossing my teeth. And it's a relief. Now, I made it very clear that I don't agree with everything he says. There are any number of quite important matters I disagree with him on. You know, he has not advocated the big lie on the Trump loss in 2020. I say loss. Not nearly as much as a lot of other Fox hosts have, though he has kept the door open to it. And, you know, to me, that's a disappointment. I wish that he had renounced it. And there are a whole other range of issues, you know, abortion. I support abortion access. He's not too keen on it. But there are other issues that I agree with him on. And it's a relief to see them represented in the media. And you can't find these positions represented with brio anywhere else. And, you know, my main point is that he's entertaining. He's fun to watch. It's enjoyable even when I disagree with him. The delivery is, it's skillful. It's persuasive in a not badgering way. He's not hitting you over the head. It's very well packaged. He comes across as appealing. Yeah, I have no idea what he's really like as a person, but so I can only speak for what he is like as a media personality. But the reason the left hates him so much is that he's so good at what he does. I mean, that's his whole thing. That's why he drives them crazy. And that's the few people who've actually watched him, because typically in the United States, most of the people who really revile Tucker Carlson have never watched him.
Well, that's fascinating. As you say, by having a great comparison there, you know, Tucker Carlson does really seem to stand out from a lot of the kind of punditry in America. Do you think there's perhaps a sense, I mean, you write in the piece, you talk about sort of how many pundits are fun to watch. Do you think that he perhaps has that kind of sense of being able to rise out of those kind of left-right divides? Because he does seem to attract, you know, a huge number of people across the spectrum in a way in which most people in Fox can't do. And is it that sense of fun, really, that sets him apart? And why doesn't other networks have someone like Tucker Carlson, frankly?
I think they're rare. And originality is not often promoted these days. It's mediocrity is promoted. And he's a maverick, a genuine maverick. Sarah Palin ruined that word for some time, but I think we can take it back. And he isn't always a straight down the line Republican, which is one of the reasons that he makes a lot of Republicans nervous, because, you know, he isn't a party animal. He likes thinking about things. There's a consistency to his viewpoints, but that doesn't mean that they hang together in a party political way. And I think that's one reason that he makes Fox nervous. He's, you know, it's been fascinating to me how big this story has become. You know, it's just one pundit. The size of his audience is often quoted like 3.3 million people out of 340 million Americans. That's not that big. But it's regarded as of enormous political importance, and it's really shaking up the media landscape. And everyone is on the edge of their chairs wondering what he's going to do next. So he must be enjoying this in a way. I have a feeling he did not enjoy getting fired, but he's in a position of remarkable amount of power and ability to call his own shots right now.
Yes, because I mean, other people have left the Fox News firmament, people like Bill O'Reilly, etc., and haven't really had the kind of same impact or clout as they did on that network. Do you think perhaps Tucker Carlson is an exception because of, as you say, Lionel, those talents, that ability to have a sense of fun, which means that he's not just confined to the narrow world of kind of conservative politics, but is rather a bigger personality who could probably find a platform elsewhere?
Well, you've got people like Andrew Sullivan claiming that he should run for president. I'd be surprised if he did. He's repeatedly said that he doesn't have any political ambitions, and he's clearly good at what he does, and I don't see why he would want to not keep doing it. Being president is kind of a drag. I think most people think it's all about campaigning and attention and pomp, but actually you have to make a lot of decisions and read a lot of crap that is incredibly boring. And I think that the pomp gets tiresome. I think the whole thing gets tiresome. I don't understand why most people who become president want a second term. Even Trump, I think he wants to run for president. I'm not convinced he wants to be president again. So I'd be surprised if Carlson went for a political option. But it will be a very interesting test of how well you can do outside of mainstream media outlets. And there are other examples like Joe Rogan, who has a huge audience and a much bigger one than he would get on like a cable news show. So we'll see what Carlson does. I will be intrigued, and it's not impossible either that he just disappears. I mean, that can happen, but he's a very talented newscaster. He's a whatever you think of his positions, with which as I noted, I differ a lot, especially on Ukraine. But he's gifted as a persuader and as an entertainer, and he's smart. He's very smart. He's well educated. So a lot of the people on Fox come across as frankly poorly educated, and their style of persuasion is clumsy and obvious. They're often just as earnest as the liberal commentator, and they err on the side of the snide, which is not a good look. Carlson is head and shoulders above all of these people at Fox. And I just think that he's something of a sui generis, a one of a kind. And Fox is going to have a very hard time replacing him in that 8 o'clock slot.
Yes, and in terms of replacing him, I mean, he has been the kind of most Ukraine skeptic voice in American mainstream media. Do you see anyone stepping in to fill that gap? Will that view be articulated, or is it perhaps a case of, this is just not going to be a view that's articulated going forward, certainly not on Fox or any of the mainstream platforms?
I think the opposition to supporting Zelensky is not seen as a very winning Republican position. There is pretty broad bipartisan support for military aid to Ukraine right now in the United States, and Carlson is one of the only people in a prominent position who is saying, this shouldn't be our problem. We should be saving the money for opposing China, and there are all these bad things that go on in the world all the time, and we can't fix them. We have to pick our spots. Carlson is something of an anti-interventionist. I just don't hear that anywhere else. Now, I think that means that there's a place for it. If we're going to have an intelligent discussion about that much money and an issue of that much consequence, then we need to hear all sides of the issue. And so when I'm listening to Carlson on Ukraine, I'm busy disagreeing with him, but I'm interested in the argument, and I'm glad someone is making it. If only, when you do have an intelligent discussion about something from more than one side, then it pushes you to refine your own position and to come up with a reply. So, that is what we are supposed to be doing in the media.
Now that Tucker's gone, who will you be watching instead?
Funnily enough, I've been watching Victor Davis Hanson videos. He's even more drastic than Carlson is. So I think I've just crawled further down the rabbit hole.
Well, thank you very much, Joe's on SpecTV, Lionel. Appreciate it. That's it for this week. Once again, thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring the Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord will provide you with the expertise you need to help build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Thanks again for joining, and I hope to see you next week.